In late November of 2013, Family Guy did something it had never done before. It killed the family dog Brian, for real, and it played the death completely straight. No jokes, no silly music, just a family sobbing around an empty bed. Within days, more than 100,000 people signed a petition begging the writers to bring him back. Most people brush this show off as a pile of crude, throwaway gags built for cheap shocks and nothing more. That picture misses the darker things sitting underneath. Family Guy hurt people on purpose. It wounded its own fans, turned its beloved characters against each other, and bruised real, living people, then sat back and studied the fallout. The cruelty was almost always planned, built by folks who knew exactly what they were doing. We are going to walk through banned episodes, lawsuits, bitter feuds, a real tragedy, and the 10 minutes that almost erased the entire show. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Let's get into it. The dog who died twice. By the time Family Guy reached its 12th season, the show had already lived several lives. It had been canceled by its own network twice in its early years and clawed its way back both times. It had grown from a small, struggling cartoon into one of the most watched comedies on television, and it had settled into a shape that almost anyone could picture without thinking. Peter, the loud and clumsy father who breaks everything he touches. Lois, the wife who somehow stays calm in the middle of his messes. Meg, the daughter the whole family treats like garbage. Chris, the slow and sweet older son. Stewie, the baby with the voice of a grown man and a head full of plans to rule the world. And Brian, the family dog who walks on two legs, drives a car, mixes himself drinks, and talks like the smartest person in the house. Brian was always the strange one. A dog who behaved like a worn-out adult. He spent his days writing books that nobody bought, chasing women who never loved him back, and lecturing the family about right and wrong at the dinner table. He drank too much. He failed at school more than once. He thought of himself as a deep thinker and a great writer, even though the world kept telling him he was neither. For all those flaws, he had one thing that made him matter more than the rest. He loved Stewie, and Stewie loved him. The baby and the dog were best friends, and their friendship was the warmest, most honest thing the show ever built. When the two of them went on trips together, argued, or pulled each other out of danger, the jokes paused and something real slipped in. For a show stuffed with quick gags and silly side jokes, those quiet moments between a baby and a dog were as close as it ever came to having a heart. All of that is why the choice the writers made in season 12 cut so deep. They took the one bond that felt true and turned it into a weapon aimed straight at the people watching. The episode carried the simple title, Life of Brian. It first aired in late November of 2013. For most of its opening minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Brian and Stewie goof around the way they always do. The two of them decide to play a game of street hockey in front of the house. Stewie ducks back inside to grab his knee pad. While he is gone, a car comes speeding down the road and slams into Brian, who is left lying in the street. A small and quietly cruel detail sits earlier in that same episode. For years, Stewie carried a time machine, a gadget he used over and over to undo mistakes and escape trouble. In Life of Brian, before any of the bad stuff happens, Stewie destroys that time machine with his own hands. He says he is tired of everything going wrong every time the two of them use it. So he smashes the one tool that could have rewound the day, and he does it without knowing he is about to need it most. By the time the car hits Brian, the safety net the show always relied on has already been torn down. The hospital scene is the part that left people stunned. Brian does not shake it off the way cartoon characters usually do. The family rushes him to the animal hospital, where the doctor tells them there is nothing left to be done. They gather around his bed. With everyone there, Brian thanks the family for the wonderful life they gave him, tells them he loves them, and slips away. The whole family is left crying around an empty bed. What makes that scene hit so hard is the way it was put together. Family Guy almost never sits still. It crams nearly every minute with jokes, random flashbacks, and side trips that have nothing to do with the story. The death scene strips all of that away. No jokes break the silence, no cheerful music sneaks in to soften the blow. The room is still, the family is sobbing, and the dog dies for real, with the show refusing to turn it into a laugh. A series that treats almost everything in life as a setup for a punchline chose to play a death completely straight, and that choice alone was enough to knock the wind out of longtime fans. Then the writers pushed even harder. Within the story, and within days for the people watching at home, the Griffins bring home a new dog named Vinny. He is a smooth-talking dog with a heavy accent, given his voice by Tony Sirico, an actor famous for playing tough guy gangsters. Vinny settles into the house. He charms the family. He even begins to grow close to Stewie, slipping into the empty spot Brian left behind. Every sign pointed in one direction. Brian was gone. This new dog was the future, and the change was meant to stick. It looked final. It felt final. Most people believed it. The response was enormous, and a lot of it was pure anger. Fans did not treat the death as a clever surprise to enjoy. They treated it as the show murdering a member of the family. Petitions appeared online almost overnight, begging the writers to undo it. More than 100,000 people signed one of them. Others built pages and flooded the internet with pleas for the dog to come home. Grown adults who had watched since they were children admitted they felt honestly heartbroken. The same ache a person feels when a real pet dies. The show had spent more than 10 years making Brian feel like family, and the cost of all that closeness came due in a single week. Brian stayed dead for about 2 episodes. During that stretch, Stewie wandered through his days hollow and sad, missing his friend in a way the show did not rush to fix. Then came the holiday episode titled Christmas Guy. In it, a miserable Stewie stumbles across a working time machine left behind by an earlier version of himself. He grabs it without a second thought, travels back to the day of the accident, and shoves Brian out of the road just before the car can reach him. Brian lives. Vinny and the entire death vanish from the timeline, wiped away as though they never existed. Brian strolls back into the house alive and whole, and the family welcomes him as if he had never been gone. The man who created the show, Seth MacFarlane, spoke about the whole stunt afterward. He said the team had been surprised, in a happy way, that people still cared enough about the dog to get that furious. He admitted they had hoped to stir up a small reaction, though the size of the rage caught them completely off guard. Once Brian was back, MacFarlane posted a short joke online suggesting that nobody should have ever believed the show would kill the dog for keeps. By his own account, the death had been a test of whether the show could still reach people after so many years on the air, and the loud, furious answer proved that it could. The deeper question is why it hurt as much as it did. A large part of the answer lives in the bond between Brian and Stewie. A baby and a dog have no business being the emotional center of a cartoon, and yet that is exactly what they became. They needed one another. The baby was lonely and odd and a little cruel, and the dog was the only one who ever treated him like he was worth something. So when Brian died, the show did far more than drop a character from the cast. It tore apart the one true friendship it had, and the empty space left behind was something every viewer could feel. Time made the wound worse. Family Guy had been on the air for well over a decade by 2013. A kid who watched the early seasons had become a teenager or a young adult by the time the dog died. For many of those people, the show had played quietly in the background of their entire childhood. Brian had been a fixture in their living rooms for years, and losing him felt like losing a small piece of their own past. Shows watched for long enough stop feeling like shows. They turn into something steady and familiar, always there, easy to lean on. Pulling Brian out of that picture reminded everyone that even the things that seem permanent can be taken away without warning. Underneath all of it sat a broken kind of trust. The unspoken deal with the audience had always been that Family Guy was a comfort, loud and rude and ridiculous, but ultimately safe, a place where every character bounced back by the next week. Killing Brian shattered that promise. For a handful of weeks, the show stopped being a soft place to land and turned into something that could reach in, take a beloved thing away, and keep it. The death of Brian is where the darker shape of Family Guy first comes into focus. People often dismiss the show as a pile of crude jokes built for cheap shocks and nothing more. The killing of Brian tells a different story. The writers understood with perfect clarity how much the audience loved that dog, and they used that love on purpose. They reached into the people watching, found the tender spot, and pressed down hard. Then, once the anger swelled loud enough, they reached back in and undid the damage. A show able to pull off a trick like that to make a death feel real and then erase it holds far more power over its viewers than its silly reputation would suggest. The same move would echo through the rest of the show's history. Again and again, Family Guy would wound the characters and the fans closest to it, study the fallout, and then decide whether to heal it or let it bleed. The hurt was almost always on purpose, planned by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Killing the dog was loud by design. The whole world saw it, argued about it, and grieved over it, and the show made certain no one could look away. Some of the darkest things Family Guy ever created, though, were built to stay hidden. Locked away somewhere was an entire episode the network refused to let near a single television, a story judged so risky that it sat buried for years while the show carried on, as if it had never been made at all. Section 2. The episode they locked away. The death of Brian came late in the show's life, long after Family Guy had grown into a giant. The story in this section reaches back to the opposite end, to the early years when the show was small, shaky, and fighting just to stay on the air. Around the year 2000, Family Guy was far from the comedy powerhouse it would later become. Its ratings were weak. The network kept dragging it around the schedule and dropping it against bigger shows that crushed it. Cancellation hung over the whole thing like a cloud that never moved. In those nervous days, the writers finished an episode that the people in charge took one look and decided to bury. The episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It was built to air during the second season, somewhere around the year 2000. The bosses at Fox watched it, grew worried, and flatly refused to put it on television. They were afraid it could be seen as cruel toward Jewish people, and they wanted nothing to do with the anger that might follow. So the finished episode was shelved. It sat in a drawer, unwatched, while the show limped along and was eventually canceled. For about 3 years, most people had no clue it even existed. Money is where the story begins. Peter has made another one of his foolish blunders and finds himself broke and desperate for a way out. Slumped at home, he lands on a plan to fix everything. He decides he needs a Jewish person to handle his money for him. The idea grows out of an old and unfair belief, one that has drifted around for a very long time, that says all Jewish people are clever with cash. Peter, being Peter, swallows that ugly idea whole, and he prays out loud for a Jew to come and rescue him from his troubles. Almost on cue, a car breaks down right in front of the Griffin house. The driver is a kind, soft-spoken money manager named Max Weinstein, who happens to be Jewish. Peter is thrilled. He befriends Max, grows fascinated by his religion, and becomes convinced that being Jewish is the hidden key to being smart and doing well in life. From there, his thinking spirals into something even more absurd. He decides his slow son, Chris, ought to become Jewish so the boy will turn out clever and successful. He even tries to rush Chris through a fast version of a bar mitzvah, the ceremony that marks a Jewish child growing into a young adult, just to lock the whole thing in. Lois, always the steady one, fights to stop him, trying again and again to explain that how well a person does in life has nothing to do with which religion they follow. The most famous moment in the whole episode is a song. While Peter is begging the heavens for a Jewish helper, he bursts into a cheerful little tune called I Need a Jew. The melody is lifted straight from a beloved old song in the Disney movie Pinocchio, the soft and dreamy one about wishing on a star. That gentle, innocent tune floats underneath while Peter happily sings about wanting a Jewish person to come fix his bank account. The gap between the sweet music and the clueless, hurtful words is the entire engine of the joke. The target of all that comedy is Peter himself. He is the idiot of the story, the man so ignorant that he treats a whole group of real human beings like a magic charm for his money problems. Every dumb thing he says falls back onto his own head, never onto the people he babbles about. Max comes across as patient and decent. Lois comes across as right. Peter is left as the fool, whose silly beliefs blow up in his face by the end. The humor was built to laugh at the bigot, while the bigot stays far too dense to realize that he is the one being laughed at. None of that careful design mattered to the network. The people in charge at Fox knew that plenty of viewers would only catch the surface of the thing, only hear the rough jokes and the unfair ideas, and would switch off before ever working out who the real target was. A song called I Need a Jew, belted out by the star of a primetime cartoon, was exactly the sort of thing that could set off a firestorm, no matter how clever the writing buried underneath it happened to be. So the network chose the safe road. They locked the episode away instead of gambling on the public understanding the joke. Seth MacFarlane, the man who created the show, had actually tried to handle the touchy material with some care. Before the episode was even finished, he showed the script to two rabbis, the religious leaders of Jewish communities, to hear whether they felt it crossed a line. He was sure the joke clearly pointed at Peter's stupidity and nowhere else. The network still said no. In those early years, the show had neither the muscle nor the army of loyal fans it would need to push back against a call like that. The decision was made over the creators' heads, and there was little they could do but watch their work disappear. Daylight finally reached the episode in 2003. By then, the show had been pulled back from the grave by strong reruns and surprising DVD sales, and Family Guy was climbing toward a comeback. The buried episode first surfaced on a DVD collection in the fall of that year, giving fans their first real look at the thing Fox had hidden from them. Not long after, in November of 2003, it aired on Cartoon Network's late-night Adult Swim block. MacFarlane even taped a short introduction for that showing, gently mocking Fox for being too frightened to air it the first time around. More than a year later, in December of 2004, a cleaned up and trimmed down version of the episode at last aired on Fox, the same network that had once treated it like poison. The trouble did not end the moment the episode reached the public. The company that owned the rights to the original Pinocchio song was not pleased that Family Guy had twisted its gentle, famous melody into a joke about money and religion. That company hauled the show into court, arguing the song had been swiped and abused. The legal battle dragged on for years before a judge finally sided with Family Guy. The ruling said the joke version of the song was allowed because it was a comedy that poked fun at the original rather than a plain copy of it. The show kept its offensive little tune, and it kept the right to make more like it in the future. The whole long saga says a great deal about the strange tightrope Family Guy has always walked. The show made its name by going further than other comedies dared, by blurting out the things that made people gasp and clutch their chests. Yet here it leaned on an old and hurtful idea about an entire group of people, then asked everyone watching to trust that it was all meant in good fun. Some viewers found the joke sharp and even brave, a clever trap built to mock a fool. Others found it lazy and mean, no matter who was supposedly being mocked. Both of those reactions have shadowed the show across its entire life. The episode shoved a hard question in front of everyone. When a joke uses a hateful idea as its very foundation, does it truly matter that the joke is secretly laughing at the person who believes it? There is also the strange and heavy power the network held in those days. A complete episode, fully written, drawn, voiced, and scored, was simply made to vanish because a small group of bosses feared how people might react. The people who poured months into making it had no say at all. The fans did not even know there was anything to miss. For 3 long years, a chunk of the show lived only inside a vault, hidden from the public by the very company that had paid to bring it to light. The young and fragile Family Guy could be silenced with a single decision. The older, stronger Family Guy would eventually learn how to fight for its work, though that lesson was still a long way off. This is the second face of the show's dark side. The first one, the death of Brian, grew out of the writers reaching out to wound their own fans on purpose. The Weinstein episode shows the hurt flowing from the other direction, with the network reaching in to clamp a hand over the writer's mouth. A show can carry darkness in what it chooses to say, and it can also be twisted by what it is forbidden to say. Family Guy held both kinds at the same time. It shoved against every wall it could find, while the people who owned it shoved right back, sometimes by making an entire episode disappear. The tale of the buried episode is the story of that wrestling match in its earliest and most bare-knuckle form. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Religion, as it happened, was a subject hot enough to keep a finished episode trapped in the dark for years before it ever flickered onto a screen. There was another topic out there, though, heavier still and far more bitterly divided, that the writers would one day decide to reach for anyway. The episode they would build around it pushed past anything the Weinstein story ever attempted. That episode has never once aired on American television, not back when it was made and not in all the years since, and the reasons behind that wall of silence lead into one of the darkest corners of the entire show. Section 3. The episode America was never allowed to see. By the time the 8th season rolled around, Family Guy was no longer the weak little show the network could shove around without a fight. The years in the wilderness were over. Reruns and DVD sales had turned it into a monster hit. It had been dragged back from cancellation. It was pulling in huge crowds, and it had become one of the most valuable comedies the network owned. Seth MacFarlane and his writers held real power now. They could take swings the early struggling version of the show never could have survived. And yet, even at the very peak of all that strength, there was one wall the show crashed into and could not break. That wall came in the shape of a single episode. The episode was called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was made to close out the 8th season around 2009 and 2010. By every measure, it should have aired like any other episode since the show by then was a giant. The network looked at what the writers had built and decided, flatly, that the people of America would never see it. That decision still stands today. The episode has never aired on American television. Not on Fox. Not on any of the cable channels that pump out endless Family Guy reruns. Not anywhere a regular American viewer could trip over it by accident. It remains the one episode the whole country was locked out of. At the center of the band episode sits Lois, the mother of the family, and the most level-headed, decent person in the house. An old friend from Lois's college days drifts back into her life. This friend and her husband badly want a baby of their own, yet they are unable to have one, so Lois agrees to do something enormous for them. She agrees to carry their baby herself, to be the one who is pregnant with it and gives birth to it, and then hand the child over to the couple it was always meant for. Then comes the cruel twist that sets the whole story spinning. The couple, the 2 people the baby was promised to, are killed in a sudden car crash. In one terrible moment, Lois is left carrying a child whose parents are gone. There is no family waiting to take the baby home. There is only Lois, pregnant, holding a choice that nobody on earth would ever want. She and Peter are forced to sit down together and face the hardest question imaginable. Do they keep the pregnancy and raise a child they never planned for, or do they end it? That question, the question of ending a pregnancy, is one of the most heated and bitterly split subjects in all of American life. People argue over it without end, and the argument digs into deep beliefs about life, faith, and right and wrong. Most comedies sprint in the other direction the second it comes up. Family Guy walked straight up to it and spun a whole episode out of it. The strange part is the care the writers brought to it. They handled this subject with a thoughtfulness they almost never showed for anything else. The episode lays out the points that people on each side of the fight tend to make, leaving room for more than one way of seeing it. One of the show's longtime writers, a man named Danny Smith, built the story, and he leaned on a serious, respected essay about the subject by the famous scientist Carl Sagan. The episode pulled from that essay to give its argument some real weight. For a show best known for crude gags and random flashbacks, it turned out to be a surprisingly careful piece of work. None of that care was enough to save it. The network judged the topic far too dangerous to set in front of a whole nation. What makes the choice even odder is when it was made. The bosses announced they would block the episode before the 8th season had even begun airing. The word came out at a big fan convention in the summer of 2009, where the show revealed that this finished episode was being pulled before anyone outside the studio had laid eyes on it. They did not stop with their own channel either. They also asked the cable network Adult Swim, which had been a loyal home to the show for years, to keep their hands off it too. The goal was complete. Not one American screen would carry it. The head of the network at the time explained the thinking behind the wall. He described the subject as one of the touchiest touchiest and most fragile topics anywhere, and he pointed out that the country was already living through a fragile, stressful stretch. In his eyes, out of every subject a show might jab at, this was the single one most likely to explode into real trouble. He felt the episode could light a fire the network had no wish to fight, and he decided it simply was not worth the risk. So a finished, fully built episode of one of the biggest comedies on television was quietly sealed off from the entire United States on purpose by the very people who paid for it. A strange agreement hides underneath all of this. The network had actually allowed the writers to make the episode in the first place. The deal between MacFarlane and Fox ran in an unusual way. The network handed the show permission to build risky material, with a clear understanding that it could always refuse to air the result later. MacFarlane himself said he was perfectly fine with that arrangement. So the writers were given the freedom to make something this bold while knowing the whole time that it might be snatched away from them. They poured the work in regardless. Then, just as everyone half expected, the network pulled the lever and shut it down. The episode was practically made to be hidden, piece of work with a lock fitted to its door before it was even finished. The episode was never fully wiped off the planet. Across the ocean, in the United Kingdom, a channel called BBC Three went right ahead and aired it. British viewers watched the whole thing on the 20th of June in 2010, sitting in its normal late evening time slot, and the channel kept airing it again over the following years. The episode also landed on the Season 8 DVD box set, including the copies sold inside the United States, which created a bizarre situation. An American could buy the episode on a disc and watch it at home all they wanted, yet they could never catch it on the same channels that aired the show every single night of the week. For a long while, it was also the one episode left off the streaming service that carried all the rest, leaving an odd hole in the lineup that fans spotted right away. What the ban reveals is something important about the edges of the show's power. Family Guy spent years building a name as a series that would say anything, mock anyone, and trample over every line in the sand. The death of Brian showed it could wound its own fans. The Weinstein episode showed it could be silenced back in its weak early days. This episode showed something humbler and a little surprising. Even when the show was rich, beloved, and powerful, there was still one subject so charged that the bosses would rather hide a finished episode forever than risk the fallout of airing it. The show could shove against nearly everything in the world. This one topic shoved back harder than the show could manage, and it won. A big reason the topic carried so much danger is the way it slices the country in half. A joke about a celebrity might draw a few angry letters. A story about ending a pregnancy reaches down into beliefs people hold close and personal on both sides of the line. A network risks far more than hurt feelings with material like that. It risks losing the companies that pay for its ads, sparking protests outside its doors, and getting hauled into a national shouting match it never wanted any part of. For a business built on selling ad time during a cartoon, the math was easy. The safest move was to make the episode disappear from American air and never glance back. That is precisely what they did, and the silence has held now for well over a decade. This is the deepest version of the darkness running underneath Family Guy. The show carries danger in what it chooses to say, danger in what it is forbidden to say, and danger in the quiet deals struck out of sight behind the scenes. Partial terms of endearment sits right where all three of those meet. The writers chose to make it, the network chose to bury it, and both sides agreed to the entire risky dance before a single frame was ever drawn. It stands as the clearest proof that no matter how huge and fearless the show grew, there was always a hand resting on the switch, ready to flip the whole thing off the instant the danger turned real. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The banned and buried episodes were kept from the public because of what they dared to say out loud. There would come a day, though, when an episode got ripped off the air for a reason nobody in the writer's room could ever have planned for. A joke that had already aired, already been laughed at, already sunk into the show's huge mountain of gags, would suddenly line up with a real and bloody tragedy out in the world. Overnight, an old throwaway joke turned into something people could not stomach, and the show found itself dragged into a storm it never saw building. Section 4. When a joke met a real nightmare by 2013, Family Guy had spent well over a decade joking about absolutely everything. No subject was safe. The show had laughed at death, at sickness, at war, at every awful thing a person could dream up. That was the whole brand. Peter and his world existed to take the ugliest parts of life and shrink them into quick, hairless jokes. Most of the time, a gag would fly by, a few people would groan, a few people would laugh, and the show would roll straight on to the next one. The 11th season sat deep inside that habit, pumping out episode after episode stuffed with jokes that treated nothing as off limits. One of those episodes was about to crash into the real world in a way that nobody could have seen coming. The episode was called Turban Cowboy. It first aired on the 17th of March in 2013. The main story follows Peter after a skydiving accident drops him into the hospital. While he heals, he strikes up a friendship with a Muslim man named Mahmoud. Peter, in his usual all-or-nothing way, throws himself into the friendship and even decides to follow Islam himself. His buddies, Joe and Quagmire, grow suspicious of the new man in Peter's life. Their worry turns out to be correct because Mahmoud is secretly tangled up in a plan to set off a bomb and blow up a bridge in the family's hometown of Wahog. The story, in plain terms, was built around a terror plot from the very beginning. That main story alone had already put the episode on shaky ground. Taking Peter's friendly new Muslim neighbor and revealing him as a hidden terrorist rubbed plenty of viewers the wrong way. Critics pointed out that the episode leaned on an ugly idea, treating an ordinary Muslim man as a secret danger. So even before anything happened in the outside world, Turban Cowboy was already an episode walking along a dangerous edge with its main plot. Buried inside that same episode, far away from the main story, sat one of the show's quick side jokes. A famous real-life sports announcer named Bob Costas, playing himself, interviews Peter about how he managed to win the Boston Marathon. The show then jumps to a flashback. Rather than running the race like everyone else, Peter simply climbs into his car and drives it down the marathon route. When a runner ends up in his way, Peter plows the person down with the car and keeps right on going. He brags about it flatly, treating the whole thing as nothing special. It was a dark throwaway gag, the same kind the show flings out by the dozen, and at the time it barely stood out from the hundreds of other rough jokes the series had aired across the years. Then the real world arrived. About a month after the episode aired, on the 15th of April in 2013, 2 homemade bombs went off near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon. The blasts killed 3 people and wounded hundreds more. Many of the injured lost arms and legs in the explosion. It was a true horror, a day of real death and real suffering for real families, and the whole country watched it unfold in shock and grief. The city was thrown into days of fear, while police hunted for the men responsible. For everyone old enough to remember it, the bombing became one of those events that stamps itself permanently into memory. Almost at once, that buried joke from a month earlier took on a sickening new shape. Family Guy had aired a scene about violence and death at the Boston Marathon, and now violence and death had struck the Boston Marathon for real. The timing was a pure ugly accident. The writers had finished the episode long before the attack, with no clue whatsoever what was coming. None of that would matter for what happened next. Someone online took the episode and twisted it into something monstrous. A user chopped up 2 completely separate scenes from Turban Cowboy and stitched them together. They grabbed the marathon car scene and glued it onto a different scene from the same episode, the one tied to the bomb plot in the main story. Stitched together that way, the fake clip made it look as though Family Guy had shown an actual bombing at the Boston Marathon, as if the show had somehow predicted or even helped cause the real attack. The clip raced across the internet, and a great many people who watched it had no idea that the 2 scenes had nothing to do with each other inside the real episode. The lie grew uglier when a well-known radio host named Alex Jones, a man famous for spreading wild and false claims to enormous audiences, threw his weight behind the fake link. He hinted that there was something dark and hidden connecting the cartoon to the real bombing. With a voice that loud pushing it along, the false story reached even more people, and the made-up tie between a silly cartoon and a national tragedy started to feel real to those who did not know any better. Those behind the show moved fast to fight back. The network pulled the episode down. They yanked it off their website, off the streaming service Hulu, off the places that sold it, and they announced they had no plans to air it again anytime soon. Seth MacFarlane, the creator, spoke out himself. He called the edited clip a vile and disgusting thing. He made it plain that the real attack was a crime and a tragedy, and that his thoughts were with the people who had been hurt and killed. The video site that had been hosting the fake clip ended up pulling it down too. The show was left scrambling to stamp out a fire that a stranger had lit using its own work as the map. This was a brand new kind of darkness for the show, and a strange one. The death of Brian had been cruelty the writers chose on purpose. The banned episodes had been the network slamming doors shut out of fear. This time, the show did nothing on purpose at all. It simply made the same sort of joke it had always made, the kind it had aired 1,000 times before, and then the world reached up, snatched that joke, and turned it into a weapon aimed back at the show. The harm came entirely from the outside, born from rotten timing, a stranger with editing tools, and a lie eager to spread. Even so, the whole mess pointed straight back at something the show had been doing for years. Family Guy built its name on the belief that nothing was sacred, that any subject, however painful, was open seasons for a quick laugh. For most of the show's life, that worked because the dreadful things it joked about were either far in the past or completely made up. The marathon joke broke that pattern in one important way. It used a real place and a real event that people cared about, and it joked about mass death happening there. When a horribly similar event then struck that exact real place a month later, the show had no shield to raise. Its name was already sitting beside that nightmare, even if only as a thoughtless gag. A series that jokes about everything will, sooner or later, watch one of its jokes drop right on top of a real wound. In 2013, that grim possibility finally came true. The episode also laid bare how dangerous the internet had become for a show like this. Once a slice of Family Guy was loose in the world, the show no longer fully owned what people did with it. A single person with a computer could carve the show into pieces, shuffle them around, and build a fresh lie out of the parts. That fake clip caused genuine harm, convincing total strangers that a cartoon was somehow mixed up in a deadly attack. The truth that the scenes were unrelated and the episode had aired first by sheer dumb chance traveled far slower than the lie ever did. The show could pull the episode and post a statement, yet it could never fully scrub the false story out of the minds of everyone who had already swallowed it whole. Taken together, the Boston episode adds a fresh and uneasy layer to the dark side of Family Guy. Up to this point, the darkness had come from choices, either the writers choosing to wound or the network choosing to hide. The Turban Cowboy mess shows that a show built on mocking everything also carries a danger it can neither control nor take back. Sooner or later, reality writes a horror that lines up with one of the old jokes, and the show is left clutching a gag it suddenly wishes it had never told. The episode eventually slipped back into reruns and onto discs once the shock had faded, but the lesson lingered. A joke can sit there harmless for a month, then turn poisonous overnight through no fault of the people who first told it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Boston tragedy dragged the show into a real-world nightmare from the outside, with no warning and no fault of its own. The man who built Family Guy, though, had once stood right at the lip of a real-world nightmare himself, years before any of this ever happened. On one perfectly ordinary morning, a small string of accidents and clumsy mistakes was the only thing standing between Seth MacFarlane and a death that would have erased his entire show from the world before most people had ever heard its name. He had been booked onto a plane he was never meant to walk away from. Section 5, the 10 minutes that saved the show. Everything in this story so far has lived inside the world of the cartoon or inside the offices where the cartoon was built. This section steps all the way outside of it into the real life of the one man without whom none of it would exist. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy. He dreamed up Peter, Brian, Stewie, and the whole town of Quahog. He gives voice to most of the main characters himself, leaping between them in a single scene without missing a beat. Pull MacFarlane out of the picture and there is no show at all, no Griffins, no jokes, nothing. And on one September morning, the entire world came within about 10 minutes of doing exactly that. The year was 2001 and Family Guy was still a small, struggling thing. The show had already been canceled once and clawed its way back from the dead. It was limping through its early seasons, getting shoved around the schedule, fighting just to hold on. MacFarlane himself was a young man, only in his late 20s, a long way from the famous and powerful creator he would one day become. At that point, he was a hard-working cartoonist with one shaky show to his name and a long, uncertain road still stretching out in front of him. Trouble and luck both began the night before. MacFarlane had traveled back east to the art college in Rhode Island, where he had studied as a student. He was there to give a talk, a proud return to his old school as someone who had gone out and made it in the world of cartoons. After the event wrapped up, he went out with some of the teachers and had a few drinks. The night ran long. By the time it was over, he had set himself up for a rough and groggy morning, the kind where the alarm feels like a personal enemy and the whole body begs for just a little more sleep. The next morning was the 11th of September. MacFarlane was booked to fly home to Los Angeles out of Boston. His flight was an early one, set to leave at 7:45 in the morning. A small mistake, though, had quietly crept into his plans. His travel agent, the person who had arranged the trip for him, had written down the wrong departure time. The paperwork told MacFarlane the plane left later than it truly did, off by around half an hour. So in his own head, he believed he had more time than he actually had. Stack a heavy hangover on top of a wrong time printed on a page, and the morning was already slipping out of his grip before he ever set foot in the airport. MacFarlane reached the airport behind schedule, moving slower than he should, sure in his mind that he still had time to spare. He made his way to the desk for his flight. The woman working there gave him the hard news. He was too late. The gate had already closed. The plane was finished boarding, and there was nothing left to be done about it. By his own telling, he missed the flight by only about 10 minutes. Irritated but calm, with no sense that anything was wrong, he accepted that he would simply have to hang around and grab a later plane home. The flight he had just missed was American Airlines Flight 11. With time on his hands, MacFarlane drifted into the airport lounge to rest. Still tired and worn down from the long night, he found a quiet spot and fell asleep. He dozed off with no idea that anything anywhere in the world was wrong. About 45 minutes later, he woke to a wave of commotion around him, people talking in low, urgent, frightened voices, the whole room gone tense and strained. Something terrible had happened while he slept. What had happened was the worst attack on American soil in living memory. Flight 11, the plane MacFarlane had been booked on, the one he had missed by 10 minutes, had been hijacked by terrorists shortly after it left the ground. They had turned the plane into a weapon and flown it straight into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. city. Every single person on board was killed. As MacFarlane sat in that lounge, slowly piecing together what was unfolding on the screens around him, he watched a second hijacked plane slam into the other tower. Then came the announcement of which flight had struck first, and the number dropped on him like a stone. It was Flight 11. It was the exact flight he had been meant to be sitting on. The full weight of that morning is hard to hold steady in the mind. If his travel agent had written down the correct time, MacFarlane very likely would have made that flight. If he had skipped the drinks the night before and woken up sharp and early, he very likely would have made that flight. A string of small, ordinary things, a few extra rounds, a typo on a slip of paper, a slow and aching start to the day, were the only reasons he was sitting safe in a lounge instead of strapped into a doomed plane high over the city. The line between his living and his dying came down to a handful of minutes and a couple of harmless seeming mistakes that, on any other morning, would have meant nothing more than a bit of bad luck and a wasted ticket. MacFarlane was not the only future star who brushed against that flight. The actor Mark Wahlberg, who years later would star right alongside MacFarlane in a hit movie about a foul-mouthed living teddy bear, had also been booked to fly on Flight 11. Wahlberg changed his plans and canceled his seat the day before the attack. So two men who would one day team up and make millions of people around the world laugh both came within a whisker of boarding that same plane that morning, and both, by completely separate strokes of luck, stepped away from it just in time. Over the years, MacFarlane has spoken about that day more than once in interviews on the radio and on television. He does not dress it up or pretend it turned him into some completely different person. He has been honest that it did not flood him with a grand new sense of purpose or change his whole outlook on life. What it left behind was something simpler and heavier, the plain and haunting knowledge of just how close he came and how thin the line between living and dying can really be. He went back to his work, back to his struggling little cartoon, carrying the quiet weight of a second chance that the people on that plane never received. This is the darkest fact in the entire story of Family Guy, and it appears in no episode anywhere. Every joke the show ever told, every character it killed off and dragged back, every episode the network buried in the dark, every fight and scandal and grim corner explored across these sections, all of it rests on the simple fact that one tired young man wrote down the wrong time and slept through a flight. If that morning had gone even slightly the other way, there would be no Brian, no Stewie, no Quahog, no band episodes, no feuds, no decades of comedy at all. The whole show, with all of its light and all of its darkness, exists only because of an accident that nearly ended its creator before the world had truly learned his name. There is a strange and uneasy echo buried in all of this as well. The show MacFarlane went on to build would spend years cracking jokes about terror, about planes, about death, and disaster of every shape. The man telling those jokes had once sat in an airport and learned that the very flight he missed had become part of the worst terror attack the country had ever suffered. He never let that hold the show back from marching into dark places. Whether that knowledge makes the comedy braver or simply stranger is a question worth sitting with for a while, though the fact underneath it stays simple and chilling. The creator of one of television's most fearless comedies lived through the kind of horror his own show would later fold into punchlines. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. MacFarlane survived that morning and went on to build one of the biggest comedy empires television has ever seen. Success on that kind of scale always makes enemies, though. Some of the loudest came from a corner few people would ever expect from other famous cartoon makers, his supposed equals in the business. They came to dislike his show so deeply and to look down on the way it was put together so completely that they would one day build an entire story around tearing it to pieces, broadcast it on their own program, and invite millions of people to watch and cheer along. Section 6, The Cartoon World Turns on Him. By 2006, Family Guy had climbed all the way back. The little show that the network once canceled twice was now a roaring hit. Its reruns played everywhere. Its DVDs sold by the truckload. Its characters showed up on shirts, posters, and lunchboxes. Peter Griffin had become one of the most recognizable cartoon faces on the planet. Success that loud, though, comes with a price. The bigger Family Guy grew, the more it stood out as a target, and a strange, quiet truth had been spreading through the world of cartoon makers for years. A lot of them could not stand the show. Behind closed doors, some of the most respected names in animation looked down on Family Guy and the way it told its jokes. In 2006, two of those names decided to stop whispering and say it out loud on television for the whole country to hear. Those two names were Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park. Their show had launched around the same time as Family Guy and lived in the same corner of television, the world of rude, grown-up cartoons that pushed every button they could find. From the outside, the two shows looked like cousins. They both used crude humor. They both got people angry. They both followed a goofy family in a small American town. Underneath the surface, though, Parker and Stone believed the two shows could not have been more different, and they had grown to genuinely dislike the way Family Guy was built. So they poured that dislike looks like into a story. The story took the shape of a two-part episode of South Park called Cartoon Wars. To understand why it landed the way it did, the real-world moment around it matters. A short time before, in 2005, a newspaper over in Denmark had printed drawings of the Prophet Muhammad, the holiest figure in the religion of Islam. Many Muslims believe that drawing Muhammad at all is a deep insult to their faith. The drawing set off a storm. Protests broke out around the world, some of them turning violent, and the whole subject of showing Muhammad on a screen or a page became one of the most dangerous things a creator could touch. Fear hung over the topic. People worried that anyone who dared to show his face might face real harm. Parker and Stone built Cartoon Wars right on top of that fear. In the story, the town of South Park learns that an upcoming episode of Family Guy is going to show the Prophet Muhammad as a character. The townspeople panic. They are terrified that putting Muhammad on television will bring some kind of attack down on all of them. In their fright, they go to absurd lengths, with whole crowds of people literally burying their heads in the sand so that nobody can accuse them of having watched the Family Guy episode. The whole thing was a way for Parker and Stone to laugh at how silly fear can make people act, and to argue that giving in to that fear is a mistake. Hidden inside that big, scary setup, though, was the real reason the episode existed. The character Eric Cartman, normally the show's little monster, sets out to get Family Guy pulled off the air for good. He pretends his goal is to protect people from the dangerous Muhammad joke. The truth comes out as the story rolls along. Cartman does not actually care about any of that. He simply hates Family Guy. He hates the way it is written, and he wants it destroyed. The Muhammad panic was just the door he used to sneak in and attack the real target, which was the show itself and the lazy way Parker and Stone thought it was put together. Then came the insult that people still quote to this day. Cartman travels to the place where Family Guy is supposedly made, expecting to find a room full of writers. What he finds instead is a tank of water filled with manatees. For anyone who does not know, a manatee is a large, slow, gentle sea animal, a soft and round creature that drifts around lazily and is not exactly famous for being clever. In the story, these manatees are the ones who write every single Family Guy joke. They do it by nudging big balls around their tank, balls with random words and ideas printed on them. The manatees push the balls into a chute, two at a time. One ball gives a setup, the next ball gives some random thing to connect it to, and out pops a joke. There is no thought behind it. There is no story behind it. The jokes are just random words bumped together by sea cows. That image was a direct punch at the way Family Guy is written, and the punch had a real point behind it. Family Guy leans heavily on quick side jokes that leap away from the main story, little flashbacks and tangents that often have nothing at all to do with what is happening in the episode. The show might be in the middle of a serious moment, then suddenly cut to a 30-second bit about something completely unrelated, then cut right back. Parker and Stone built their whole comedy a different way. On South Park, the jokes grow out of the story and the characters and whatever was happening in the real world that week. One thing leads to another for a reason. Their complaint about Family Guy was simple. They felt its jokes could be lifted out of one episode and dropped into any other, and nothing would change because the jokes were random and interchangeable, exactly like balls being shoved together by manatees. To Parker and Stone, that was the opposite of real writing. The episode wrapped all of this inside a bigger argument about fear and free speech. In the second part, the character Kyle, who usually serves as the show's voice of reason, makes a passionate case. He does not even like Family Guy. He thinks its humor is junk. Yet he argues fiercely that the network should let the Muhammad joke air anyway. His point is that the moment a show starts cutting things out because someone might get angry or scared, there is no end to it. Once you agree to block one joke out of fear, you have to block every joke that anyone, anywhere, might find offensive, until nothing is left. The manatees in the tank make the same point in their own strange way. In the story, when someone tries to pull a single idea ball out of their tank to stop the Muhammad joke, the manatees refuse to work at all. Their unspoken rule is that everything must be allowed to be mocked, or nothing can be mocked. You cannot pick and choose. A bitter twist sits at the center of all this, and it happened for real. South Park, the show preaching that no joke should ever be blocked out of fear, was itself blocked out of fear by its own network. When the moment came in Cartoon Wars for the show to actually display the image of Muhammad, the network that aired South Park refused to allow it. They cut the image out and replaced it with a plain screen of text explaining that the network had decided not to show the picture. So the very episode arguing against giving into fear was forced to give in to that exact fear, live, in front of everyone. Parker and Stone had made their whole point about standing firm, and their own bosses proved how hard that really is. The mockery of Family Guy did not happen in a lonely corner. It turned out that Parker and Stone were saying out loud what a lot of the cartoon world had been thinking in private. After Cartoon Wars aired, the creators behind other big animated shows reached out to cheer them on. By Parker and Stone's own telling, the people who made The Simpsons even sent them flowers as a thank you for ripping Family Guy apart. They have gone further in interviews, stating flatly that they have seen Family Guy and that they hate it. They have also claimed claimed that the folks behind The Simpsons hate Family Guy even more than they themselves do. So the picture that came into focus was an uncomfortable one for MacFarlane. His show was adored by millions of regular viewers, and at the same time, it was quietly scorned by many of the very people who made the cartoons sitting right next to it on the schedule. For a long while, MacFarlane and his team chose not to swing back very hard. At first, the Family Guy writers responded with a kind of shrug and a smile. On the commentary tracks included with their DVDs, they began jokingly calling their own quick side jokes manatee jokes, taking the insult and wearing it like a badge. They seemed almost amused that South Park had spent so much effort tearing them down. Real payback did finally come a few years later, in 2009, in a Family Guy episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us. In one part of that episode, Peter and his neighbor Quagmire take part in an improv show, the kind of live comedy where performers make everything up on the spot with no script. Peter performs the way Family Guy always does, throwing out silly, random, nonsense jokes, and the crowd roars with laughter. Quagmire tries to do comedy the other way, the careful, thoughtful, character-driven way that South Park's creators had praised, and his jokes fall flat to an awkward silence. The message under the scene was clear enough to anyone paying attention. Family Guy was poking fun right back at South Park's complaint, suggesting that the audience liked the random gags just fine, thank you very much. Even with that comeback, the feud stayed lopsided. Parker and Stone hammered the subject again and again over the years, in their show and in interviews, never shy about saying how little they thought of Family Guy. MacFarlane, for the most part, stayed quieter and took the higher road. Years down the line, long after the worst of it had cooled, he even spoke about South Park with open respect. He praised how sharp the show's writing was, and marveled at how fast Parker and Stone could put an episode together, turning around a story in roughly 2 weeks while the world was still talking about the events inside it. He admitted that any show able to stay great for that long was something to be amazed by. The man whose show had been compared to a tank of brainless sea animals ended up tipping his hat to the people who made the comparison. The deeper sting of the whole affair is where it came from. The death of Brian was a wound the writers gave their own fans. The banned episodes were wounds the network gave the writers. The Boston mess was a wound the wide world gave the show by accident. This wound came from inside the family of cartoon makers itself. The people mocking Family Guy were not angry strangers or scared executives. They were fellow creators, fellow comedians, people doing the exact same job in the exact same strange little world of grown-up cartoons. They were the closest thing MacFarlane had to peers, and they used their own show, watched by millions, to tell the world that his work was lazy and empty and barely counted as writing at all. Being disliked by people who do not understand your work is one thing. Being looked down on by the people who do the same work you do, who understand it perfectly well and judge it anyway, cuts in a different and lonelier way. There is something worth noticing in how that judgment has aged too. Both shows are still on the air all these years later, both of them giants in their own right, both beloved by huge crowds of loyal fans. The argument Parker and Stone started never really got settled because there may not be a right answer to it. Some people will always love the quick, random, anything-goes rhythm of Family Guy and the way it fires off 100 jokes a minute. Other people will always prefer a show where every laugh is stitched carefully into a story. The manatee insult was cruel, and it was meant to wound, yet it also forced a real question into the open that fans still argue about today. What actually makes a joke good? Is it the careful build, or is it simply whether the joke makes you laugh? Cartoon Wars dressed that question up as a brutal takedown, but the question underneath it was honest, and it has outlived the feud that gave it life. For MacFarlane, the lesson of those years was a hard and quiet one. He had survived cancellation. He had survived the network burying his work. He had even survived a brush with death itself. Now he had to survive the contempt of his own kind. The knowledge that some of the most talented people in his field thought his life's work was a joke in the worst sense of the word. He kept making the show anyway. The manatees, real or not, kept pushing their idea balls together, and the audience kept laughing season after season, no matter what the other cartoonists said about it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The other cartoon makers were one kind of enemy, the kind who fought with jokes and interviews and clever insults. The show was about to make a very different kind of enemy out in the real world. One of its sharpest and cruelest jokes would land squarely on the young child of a famous politician, a little boy with a disability, and the fight that followed would drag a real and hurting family straight into the glare of the spotlight, while the show stood by every harsh word it had aired. Section 7, the joke that hurt a real family. By 2010, Family Guy had built a long and proud habit of poking fun at famous, powerful people. Politicians, movie stars, singers, athletes, anyone who lived in the public eye was fair game. The show treated the rich and famous as targets that could take a hit, people big enough and strong enough to laugh off a joke at their expense and go on with their day. Most of the time, that worked out just fine. A celebrity might grumble in an interview, fans might argue about it online for a week, and the show simply rolled on to the next target. Every so often, often, though, the show swung its mockery at someone or something, far more fragile than a movie star's wounded pride. In the 8th season, on a Valentine's Day evening, it aired a joke that reached right past a powerful politician and brushed up against her very young child, a little boy with a disability, and the storm that came after was nothing like the usual celebrity grumbling. The episode was called Extra Large Medium. It first aired on the 14th of February in 2010. Like most Family Guy episodes, it carried two separate stories running side by side. In the main story, two of the family's children wander off and go missing in the woods, and a frightened Lois turns to a fortune teller for answers. The children turn up safe on their own, but Peter walks away convinced that the fortune teller was the real thing, and soon convinced that he himself has the very same gift. He sets himself up in business as a fake psychic, charging money and lying to sad, grieving strangers by pretending he can reach their dead loved ones. The show used that whole story to drive home a single sharp point that people who claim to read minds and speak with the dead are very often frauds, preying on the heartbroken and the desperate for a quick payday. The second story, running underneath that one, is where all the trouble lived. In it, the family's awkward middle child, Chris, lands himself a girlfriend named Ellen. Ellen is a girl with Down syndrome, a condition a person is born with that changes the way they learn and grow and develop. What made Ellen stand out so sharply on television was the way the writers chose to draw her. For a very long time, characters with Down syndrome on TV had almost always been shown as sweet, gentle, patient, and inspiring, the sort of character placed in a story to warm the heart and teach the rest of the cast a lesson about kindness. Ellen was none of those soft and tidy things. She was bossy, demanding, and flat out mean to poor Chris. She ordered him around like a servant, she slapped him, and she cut him down with insults. The show drew her as a full, flawed, difficult human being instead of a fragile little angel meant only to be pitied and protected. Then came the single line of dialogue that lit the whole fire. During a date with Chris, Ellen happens to mention her parents. She says plainly that her father is an accountant. Then she adds that her mother is the former governor of Alaska. To nearly everyone watching at home, the meaning behind that line was instantly unmistakably clear. The former governor of Alaska was Sarah Palin, one of the most famous politicians in the country, a woman who had run for vice president of the United States in 2008 and remained a constant presence in the news afterward. 2 years before this episode aired, in 2008, Palin had given birth to a son named Trig, a little boy who was born with Down syndrome. So when a pushy, mean-spirited cartoon girl with Down syndrome announced on a date that her mother was the former governor of Alaska, the show was plainly and openly pointing its finger straight at Sarah Palin and her real living son. It helps to understand just how loud and large Sarah Palin loomed at that exact moment. She had been picked to run for vice president only 2 years earlier, which had thrown her into the brightest spotlight in the country almost overnight. She had since stepped down from running Alaska, yet she stayed one of the most talked about and most divisive figures in all of American life, loved fiercely by one half of the country and disliked just as fiercely by the other. A joke about her was never going to land quiet. The show knew it was reaching for one of the most charged names it could possibly choose, and it reached anyway. Sarah Palin did not laugh. She was deeply hurt and deeply angry, and she made sure the whole world knew it. She wrote about the episode publicly, describing it as a kick in the gut. In her eyes, the show had reached into her own family, taken her real baby boy, a child with a disability whom she loved and fiercely protected, and twisted him into the setup for a cheap joke beamed into millions of living rooms. Her daughter Bristol Palin spoke up as well, and she asked a sharp, pointed question for everyone to sit with. She wondered aloud whether some things should simply be off limits, whether there were any lines left at all that people would refuse to cross when it came to her little brother and to others in the special needs community. The Palin family framed the joke for what they believed it was, an act of plain cruelty, aimed at a child far too small and too innocent to ever defend himself. Here, the story takes a sudden turn that almost nobody watching could have predicted. The character Ellen was not voiced by some ordinary actress merely pretending to have Down syndrome for the role. She was voiced by a woman named Andrea Faye Friedman, a real working actress who herself had been born with Down syndrome. Friedman was no newcomer either. She had been acting in television for the better part of 2 decades, appearing in a string of well-known shows over the years. One of those earlier roles had been in a famous and beloved drama series built around a young man with Down syndrome, a show widely praised in its day for its warm, gentle, heart-tugging treatment of the condition. So Friedman knew, better than almost anyone alive, both sides of how people like her tend to be written for the screen. She had lived inside the soft, tender version of the story years before, and now she was being handed the loud, rude, difficult version. And when Sarah Palin stood up and publicly attacked the episode, Friedman did something startling. She fired right back, planting herself firmly on the side of the show that Palin was trying to tear down. Friedman wrote a public response of her very own, and it pulled no punches. She said straight out that she thought the joke was funny, and she figured the former governor simply did not have much of a sense of humor. She explained that in her family, laughing was always treated as a good and healthy thing, and that her own parents had raised her to enjoy a joke and to live a full, normal life just like anyone else. Then she delivered a hard line all her own. She said that her mother had never once carried her around like a loaf of bread, the way she believed Palin paraded her son Trig around in public, in Friedman's blunt opinion, chasing sympathy and votes. With those words, a grown woman who actually lived every single day with Down syndrome had marched directly into the middle of the fight and planted herself squarely against the powerful politician who claimed to be standing up for people exactly like her. Friedman's sharp reply traveled far and fast. Newspapers printed it, websites shared it, and a great many readers cheered her on, delighted to see a woman with Down syndrome speak so boldly for herself against a famous and powerful politician. Her closing jab about the loaf of bread, in particular, got passed around endlessly as one of the great comebacks of the whole affair. Within the wider world of families and groups who care for people with disabilities, though, the reaction stayed split. Some welcomed Friedman's words as a powerful blow struck for treating disabled people as full and capable grown adults. Others felt that one person's comfort with the joke did not magically make the joke a kind one, and that plenty of families had every right to feel wounded by it. The argument never fully closed. The man behind the show stood firmly behind the episode, too. Seth MacFarlane defended both the joke and the careful way that Ellen had been written. He went on a well-known late-night talk show hosted by Bill Maher and walked through the whole thing in front of an audience. His argument, and the argument of the many people who lined up to agree with him, went something like this. For decades upon decades, characters with disabilities had been handled on television with kid gloves, shown only ever as sweet and helpless and quietly inspiring, never once allowed to be rude or bossy or selfish or fully messily human. By writing Ellen as a real person, flaws and sharp edges and all, even a mean and overbearing one, the show was actually treating her as an equal, a character that the audience is allowed to dislike. The thinking went, is a character being taken seriously as a true person, rather than being propped up as a fragile symbol to feel sorry for. This fit neatly with the way Seth MacFarlane had always described his own comedy. From the show's earliest days, he had argued that the fairest kind of humor is the kind that spares no one at all. In his view, choosing to shield one group from jokes while happily mocking every other group is its own quiet kind of insult, a way of treating that group as too weak or too precious to handle what everyone else is asked to handle. So the show made a point of aiming at every race, every religion, and every kind of person it could find. By that way of thinking, leaving people with disabilities off the list would have been the truly unfair move. Whether a person buys that reasoning or rolls their eyes at it tends to decide how they feel about nearly every hard joke the show has ever told. Plenty of people refuse to buy that explanation for a second. A long-running watchdog group that had spent years attacking Family Guy over its content slammed the episode without mercy. That same group had been at war with the show for ages, naming it again and again among the worst things on television and pushing people to complain to the government about its jokes, so its outrage came as no shock to anyone. And plenty of ordinary viewers felt that all the fancy talk about equalities and respect was nothing more than a clever coat of paint, a smart-sounding excuse slapped over a joke that, deep down at its very core, made fun of a baby with a disability purely for the sake of a laugh. To these people, it did not matter one bit how cleverly the show chose to dress the thing up afterward. Reaching out and pointing at a real named child, then using that child's condition as the punchline of a gag was a cruel act, plain and simple, and no amount of explaining could scrub the cruelty out of it. The disagreement split right down the middle of the country, and both sides dug in and held their ground. The strangest part of the entire mess is how the episode actually performed once the dust settled. Despite the loud and bitter public fight raging around it, most of the reviewers who sat down and watched Extra Large Medium ended up genuinely liking it. They praised the story, and a number of them even praised the bold way it handled the character of Ellen. Millions of homes tuned in to watch. The controversy, for all of its heat and noise, did nothing whatsoever to slow the show down. The show had reached out and touched one of the single most sensitive subjects imaginable, a real child with a real disability, and it had walked away with strong reviews and big audience numbers, even as a famous and furious family stood there accusing it of heartless cruelty. This particular controversy cut in a way that the earlier ones simply did not, and the reason comes down to exactly who sat at the very center of it. A joke aimed at a singer or at a politician's speeches lands on a grown adult, someone who chose a public life with their eyes open and who can fire right back on roughly equal footing. This joke, though, reached toward a baby, a child far too young to understand a word of it, born with a condition through no choice and no fault of his own. For a parent, and most of all for a parent of a child who needs extra care and extra protection from the world, a joke like that does not register as ordinary teasing at all. It feels instead like a direct attack on the most defenseless person in their entire life. That is the reason Palin's words carried such such raw and obvious pain, and the reason so many parents of children with disabilities step forward to stand right beside her. At the very same time, the episode dragged an uncomfortable but genuinely real question out into the open, and the person who pressed that question hardest was the actress with Down syndrome herself. Is it truly kinder to treat people with disabilities as delicate treasures who must always be handled with extreme gentleness, shielded carefully from every joke and every harsh word and every ordinary insult? Or is real, honest respect found instead in treating them exactly like everyone else, which has to mean allowing them to be funny, flawed, rude, selfish, and even thoroughly unlikable, the same as any other character walking around on the show? Andrea Faye Friedman clearly believed in the second answer with her whole heart. In her eyes, being written as a normal, imperfect girlfriend, even a bossy and difficult and unpleasant one, was itself a form of equality that the soft, pitying, tiptoeing portrayals had never once bothered to offer her. The fight over Ellen was, underneath all the shouting, really a fight over what the word respect even means, and thoughtful, reasonable people came down firmly on opposite sides of it. It helps to remember, too, that Family Guy had never exactly treated disability with delicate care anywhere else in its run. One of the show's main recurring characters, Joe Swanson, the police officer who lives right next door to the Griffins, uses a wheelchair, and the show has spent years cracking joke after joke at the expense of the fact that he cannot walk. His own friends mock him for it, leave him stranded and behind, and treat his wheelchair as a steady, reliable source of cheap laughs episode after episode. So Ellen fit neatly into a long and well-worn pattern. The show had always been perfectly willing to dig for humor in bodies and minds that work differently from most, and the Palin episode was simply the loudest, most public, most headline-grabbing example of a habit that had been baked into the series since its earliest days on the air. There is one more layer worth pulling apart here, which is the question of who the joke was truly aimed at. Some defenders of the episode argued that the show was never really laughing at children with Down syndrome at all. The real target, they said, was Sarah Palin herself, a powerful public figure who had often spoken about her son and her family while out campaigning. In that reading, Ellen being bossy and sharp-tongued was a way of poking at Palin, hinting that her household was no gentle fairy tale, rather than a way of mocking the boy. Critics shot right back that none of that fine print mattered to a viewer sitting at home, because the thing up on the screen was still a girl with Down syndrome being played for laughs, with a real child's condition dragged in by name. The joke pointed in two directions at the very same time, toward a politician who could absolutely take a hit, and toward a baby who could not, and that double aim is a huge part of why the fight over it never found a clean ending that everyone could accept. This episode shows the dark side of Family Guy stretching to one of its most uncomfortable points. The show had wounded its own loyal fans by killing Brian. It had been muzzled by its own network over religion and over the ending of a pregnancy. It had been twisted by the wider world into a fake and ugly link to a deadly bombing. It had been openly scorned by its fellow cartoon makers. Now it had taken careful aim at a real child with a disability and then flatly refused to back down even when a heartbroken family begged it to stop. The show planted its flag and defended the joke as a strange and backwards kind of respect, while its critics saw nothing in it but cruelty wrapped up in clever, self-serving words. Both of those things can somehow be true at the very same time, and that is precisely what makes the whole moment so impossibly hard to settle. The show was, in one and the same breath, doing something that many people found genuinely heartless, and something that its defenders called genuinely brave. The Palin fight also laid bare something deeper about the unspoken deal that Family Guy had always made with the world. The show built its entire name and its entire reputation on a single bold promise, that it would march anywhere and mock anyone, that no person and no subject anywhere was ever too sacred or too tender to touch. Most of the time, that fearless promise made people laugh until they ached. But every so often, the very same promise dragged the show straight into a place where the laughter soured in people's mouths, where a joke stopped feeling like harmless fun and started feeling like a thumb pressed hard into a real person's open wound. And the show almost never once apologized in those darker moments. It stood by its work, argued its case loudly, and strolled on to the next episode, leaving the people it had stung behind to deal with the hurt entirely on their own. That stubborn refusal to ever flinch is a big part of what made the show so famous, and a big part of what made its dark side so genuinely, deeply dark. For Sarah Palin and her family, the episode never truly faded away. It became, in their eyes, one more glaring example of a culture far too willing to use a child's disability as a cheap source of entertainment for the mass. For Andrea Faye Friedman, the very same episode became a proud and defiant moment of standing up and speaking loudly for herself on her own terms against a famous and powerful person who was trying to speak in her place. And for the show itself, it became simply one more controversy survived. One more angry headline weathered without harm, one more bright line crossed with no lasting damage at all to its ratings. The exact same joke meant meant something completely and wildly different, depending entirely on who happened to be looking at it. And all these long years later, people still cannot fully agree among themselves on whether the show went much too far that night or whether it actually did something strange and oddly fair. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fights over real people kept rolling in, one after another, but some of the very deepest betrayals in all of Family Guy happened inside the show itself between the characters that the fans had grown to love the most. One of the single most beloved figures in the entire long-running series was about to turn on another right to his face in one short and savage speech that viewers have simply never been able to forget. With just a handful of cold and brutal words, he would tear a so-called friend completely to pieces, dragging out into the light a deep and quiet cruelty that the show had been carefully building toward, scene by scene, for years on end. Section 8. The friend who tore Brian apart. The darkest moments covered so far mostly came from the outside, from angry families, frightened networks, and rival cartoon makers throwing stones. This section turns the camera back inside the show itself into the little circle of friends at the heart of Quahog, because some of the cruelest things Family Guy ever did were done by its own characters to one another. And the single most savage example landed on the family dog Brian in a moment that fans have replayed and argued over ever since. To understand why it hurt, it helps to know who Brian was to the show and to the people watching. Brian Griffin was the smart one. He walked on two legs, drove a car, and spoke like the most well-read person in any room. He thought of himself as a writer and a thinker, a dog with deep opinions about politics, books, and the right way to live. For years, the show used Brian as its calm, reasonable voice, the character who would step back and say something sensible while everyone else acted like fools. Many viewers saw him as the heart of the show, the one decent head among a cast of idiots and lunatics. He was easy to like and easy to root for. There is a deeper layer to Brian too, one that makes what happened to him even stranger. Brian was widely understood to be a stand-in for the show's creator, Seth MacFarlane. The opinions Brian held about religion, about politics, about how the world ought to work, lined up closely with the real opinions MacFarlane had shared in his own life. On top of that, MacFarlane gives Brian his voice. So Brian was, in a real sense, the creator speaking through a cartoon dog, the character closest to the actual mind behind the whole show. That detail matters enormously for what came next. On the other side of this story stands Glenn Quagmire. Quagmire was one of Peter's neighbors and one of the regular gang of friends. For most of the show's life, he had been pure comic relief, the over-the-top creep obsessed with chasing women, a character built almost entirely for quick, shocking laughs. Nobody watching thought of Quagmire as a source of hard truth or deep feeling. He was there to be funny and gross, and that was about it, which is exactly why what he did in this episode caught everyone so off guard. The episode was called Jerome is the New Black. It first aired on the 22nd of November in 2009. The setup begins with a loss. Cleveland Brown, another member of the friend group, had moved away to Virginia to star in his own spin-off show, leaving a hole in the gang. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire find themselves sad and lonely without him, so they set out to find a brand new friend to fill the empty seat. Their search leads them to a cool, easygoing man named Jerome, who, in a twist, turns out to be one of the men Lois had dated long ago during her wild younger days. That is the main story bouncing along on the surface. The main story carried its own streak of darkness, even apart from the speech. The new friend, Jerome, ends up moving in with the family for a while. During his stay, he cheerfully admits that he had been sleeping with Meg, the teenage daughter, a confession Peter barely even reacts to. Worse still, it comes out that Peter had grown so jealous and suspicious of Jerome that he had secretly burned the man's house down, and Peter never once gets caught or punished for it. So even the lighter half of the episode was stuffed with the casual cruelty the show loved. A friend betrayed, a daughter used, a crime quietly swept under the rug. The speech became the part everyone remembered, yet the whole episode swam in that same cold water. Underneath it runs the part that mattered. Brian discovers, almost by accident, that Quagmire does not like him. This news genuinely stings Brian. He cannot understand it. As far as Brian is concerned, he is a good guy, a likable guy, the kind of person everyone should naturally get along with. So Brian decides to fix the problem. He sets out to win Quagmire over, to charm him, to figure out what the issue is and smooth it away. He invites Quagmire over for a nice dinner, even cooks him a steak, certain that a little kindness will melt whatever cold feeling Quagmire has been carrying around. What Brian gets instead is one of the most brutal speeches in the history of the show. When Brian presses him, asking how anyone could possibly dislike him after all his friendly effort, Quagmire finally lets go. He does not shout. He does not lose his temper. He simply stands there and calmly, coldly lists out, one by one, every single reason he cannot stand Brian. And the speech goes on, point after point, for roughly a minute and a half without stopping, which on a show that usually changes the subject every few seconds is an eternity. Quagmire starts by calling Brian the worst person he knows. Then he begins counting the reasons. Brian constantly hits on Lois, the wife of Peter, who is supposed to be Brian's very best friend in the world. Peter is the man who feeds Brian, who pays for everything Brian has, who once saved Brian from dying, and the way Brian pays him back is by lusting after his wife. On top of that, Quagmire points out, Brian relieves himself all over Peter's yard, like the animal he sometimes forgets he is. Brian is a sponge who pays for nothing and lives off the kindness of a family he does not truly respect. The speech keeps going, and it keeps cutting. Quagmire tears into the idea that Brian is some great thinker and brilliant writer. He points out that Brian flunked out of college not once but twice, and cannot even spell simple words correctly, all while strutting around as though he were the smartest man alive. He goes after Brian's love life, mocking the way Brian chases shallow, good-looking women while pretending to be a deep soul who values them for their minds. Quagmire admits, fairly, that he himself chases women for their looks, but at least he says he is honest about who he is, while Brian lies to himself about it constantly. Then Quagmire takes aim at Brian's politics, the very opinions that made Brian feel so superior. He mocks Brian's habit of preaching about big causes, about wanting to make certain drugs legal, about how giant companies crush the little people, about how homelessness is the greatest tragedy in the country. And he asks the question that lands hardest of all. After all that preaching, what has Brian actually done to help anyone? The answer is nothing. Quagmire, the supposed idiot of the group, then reveals that he himself works down at a soup kitchen, quietly feeding the hungry while Brian only talks. Finally, Quagmire delivers the line that sums it all up. The thing he hates most about Brian, he says, is that underneath all the talk, Brian is a sad, lonely drunk and a bore. With that, Quagmire thanks Brian flatly for the steak and walks out the door, leaving the dog standing there in stunned silence. Some fans have argued over the years that the speech would have worked better coming from a different character, someone steadier like Joe. Quagmire, after all, was a deeply flawed man himself, a creep who treated women terribly, which him a strange pick to lecture anyone about honesty or decency. Yet there is a real logic to choosing him. Quagmire's own ugliness is exactly what gave the speech its bite. He was not pretending to be better than Brian. He freely admitted his own faults right there in the middle of the takedown. That admission let him land the cruelest blow of all, the idea that being an honest creep is somehow less shameful than being a dishonest saint. Brian's great crime, in Quagmire's eyes, was the lying, the pretending, the gap between his grand lecture and his small, selfish life. The way the scene was built is a huge part of why it hit so hard. Family Guy almost never lets a serious moment breathe. It chops every scene into tiny pieces and stuffs jokes into every gap. This speech does the opposite. The camera holds steady. No silly cutaway interrupts it. No goofy music plays underneath to soften the blow. Quagmire speaks slowly and clearly, never raising his voice, which somehow makes every word land even harder than yelling would. The calmness is the cruelty. He is not exploding in anger. He has simply thought about all of this for a long time, and now he is finally saying it out loud, plainly, like a man reading a list he wrote weeks ago. There is a strange and almost unbelievable fact hiding underneath the scene too. Seth MacFarlane gives the voice to Brian. He also gives the voice to Quagmire. So in that long, brutal speech, MacFarlane was performing both sides of it at once. He was the dog getting torn to shreds, and he was the neighbor doing the tearing. One man, alone in a recording booth, played the attacker and the victim in the same breath. And since Brian stood in for MacFarlane's own real opinions, the moment becomes even odder. The creator of the show used one of his own voices to rip apart the character, who represented his own beliefs. He pointed at his own stand-in and called him a phony, a hypocrite, and a bore, in his own voice for millions of people to hear. A respected television critic noticed exactly this and found it remarkable. Writing about the episode, she pointed out how strange and even funny it was that the show would spend all this time and energy tearing down the one character who served as a mouthpiece for the man who created it. The show was, in effect, turning on itself. It was admitting out loud that its most likable and most reasonable character might actually be a fraud, and it chose the silliest character in the cast to be the one brave enough to say so. That self-attack fit a quiet pattern in how MacFarlane worked. He had never been shy about laughing at his own beliefs, and Brian was the place he kept doing it. Again and again, the show would let other characters poke holes in Brian's grand opinions and lofty speeches, treating the dog's smugness as something to be punctured rather than admired. The Quagmire speech was simply the sharpest version of that habit the moment the show stopped poking and went straight for the throat. A creator willing to mock himself that openly, through a character carrying his own voice and his own views, was doing something most comedy never bothers to attempt. Part of what made the speech feel like such a betrayal was how suddenly it appeared. In the years of episodes leading up to this one, the show had given almost no sign that Quagmire secretly despised Brian. They had hung around together as part of the same group without any obvious bad blood. Then, out of nowhere, the show revealed that Quagmire had apparently been holding all this venom inside the whole time. For Brian and for the audience, the hatred seemed to come from clear blue sky. One day, Quagmire was just the goofy neighbor, and the next he was standing in Brian's living room calmly explaining in painful detail why Brian was a waste of a soul. A betrayal stings worst when it comes from a direct reaction nobody was watching, and this one arrived from the last person anyone expected. The deepest sting of all, though, was that so much of what Quagmire said was simply true. That is what separated this speech from an ordinary insult. Quagmire was not making things up or twisting the facts to be mean. Brian really did chase after Lois. Brian really did mooch off the family. Brian really did preach about helping people while doing nothing himself. Brian really did drink too much and feel sorry for himself. Every charge in the speech could be backed up by things the audience had watched Brian do for years. The show had been quietly stacking up this evidence the whole time, scene by scene, and now it dumped the entire pile on Brian's head at once. The cruelty worked because it was honest. A lie can be brushed off. The truth, said out loud by someone who has clearly been keeping score, is much harder to survive. And the show seemed to know it was telling the truth because the things Quagmire called out did not go away afterward. In the episodes and years that followed, Brian kept right on doing the very things he had just been blasted for. He kept lusting after women he claimed to respect. He kept mooching. He kept preaching without acting. The speech turned out to be less a one-time insult and more a permanent description of who Brian really was. Quagmire had read the dog's character correctly, and the show spent the rest of its run proving him right. There is one small mercy tucked into the end of the story, and it comes from the most unlikely source. After the disastrous dinner, a crushed and hollow Brian drags himself home, clearly shaken to his core. The baby, Stewie, finds him there. And Stewie, who spends most of the show being cruel and cold himself, does something tender. He tells Brian that he does not need Quagmire to like him, that the only person whose approval he truly needs is his own. Then Stewie adds quietly that he likes Brian. He lets the dog sleep in his room that night, so Brian will not have to be alone. After a full episode of one friend ripping Brian apart, another friend gently puts a small piece of him back together. The bond between the baby and the dog, the warmest thing the show ever had, shows up right when Brian needs it most. That little moment of kindness matters because it keeps the episode from being purely heartless. The show was willing to drag its most beloved character through the mud and expose every ugly thing about him, yet it also remembered to remind everyone why Brian was worth loving anyway. Stewie still chose him. Flawed, phony, drunk, and sad as he was, Brian still had one friend in the world who saw all of it and stayed. That mix, the brutal honesty followed by the quiet loyalty, is the show at its most surprising. For the people watching, the speech split the audience in a telling way. The fans who had grown tired of Brian, tired of his lectures and his smugness and his self-pity, found the whole thing deeply satisfying. They had been waiting for years for someone to finally say all of it to the dog's face, and Quagmire said it perfect. Other fans, the ones who still loved Brian and saw him as the soul of the show, found it painful and almost mean-spirited, a gut punch aimed at a character who, for all his faults, meant a great deal to them. The fact that the same scene could feel like a celebration to one half of the audience and a betrayal to the other is exactly what made it so unforgettable. Over time, the speech grew into one of the most famous scenes the show ever produced. People who could not name a single other thing from that episode could still recall Quagmire calmly listing off Brian's sins. Fans quoted it, broke it down line by line, and pointed to it as proof that Family Guy, underneath all the random gags, was capable of writing something with real teeth. An episode that was mostly about replacing a lost friend ended up remembered almost entirely for the 90 seconds in which one friend destroyed another. The rest of the story faded away. The speech never did. When the bigger picture comes into focus, this episode shows the dark side of Family Guy turning fully inward. The death of Brian, years later, would be the show hurting its fans. The banned episodes were the network silencing the writers. The real-world scandals were the show colliding with politicians, tragedies, and rivals. This was something else, quieter and stranger. This was the show reaching into its own warm center, into the friendship at the core of the whole series, and using one beloved character to brutally expose another. The show looked at its own most likable creation, the one closest to its creator's own heart and voice, and decided to tell the truth about him, no matter how much it stung. There is a special kind of darkness in a show willing to be that honest about its own favorite. That honesty points to something about how the show sees the whole world. Family Guy does not really believe in heroes. In its eyes, everyone is a mess underneath, every good guy is hiding something rotten, and every noble speech is covering up a smaller, sadder truth. Brian had spent years posing as the one grown up in a town full of overgrown children. The speech existed to rip that pose away and show the frightened, phony creature underneath it. The show was making a hard claim about people in general, that the ones who lecture loudest about kindness are often the ones doing the least, and it chose its own favorite character to prove the point. The genius and the cruelty of the scene live in the same place. It would have been easy, and far gentler, to let Brian stay the lovable, reasonable hero forever. The show chose instead to pull back the curtain and admit that its hero was, underneath it all, a mess, and to do it through the mouth of its dumbest character, in the calmest possible voice, in the creator's own throat. The audience never quite saw Brian the same way again. Every lecture he gave afterward carried a faint echo of Quagmire's voice, reminding everyone that the dog talked a big game game and rarely backed it up. A single speech reshaped how an entire fan base understood a character they had watched for over a decade. Very few moments in any cartoon have ever done that much damage with so few words and no jokes at all. There is a thread tying this moment to the darkest thing the show would ever do to Brian. 4 seasons after this speech, the writers would kill the dog off completely, sent the fanbase into a rage. Looking back, the seeds were already planted right here. The show had shown, plainly, that it held no soft, protective feeling for Brian, that it was willing to drag him through real pain for the sake of a strong scene. The savage speech and the shocking death were 2 pieces of the very same idea, the show treating its most beloved character as something it could wound whenever a powerful moment called for it. Quagmire's words were the first deep cut. The car that killed Brian years later was the show simply traveling further down a road it had already started walking. Brian survived the speech, of course, the way characters always do. He went back to being the family dog, back to his books and his drinks and his doomed crushes. The show never undid what Quagmire said, never apologized for it, never softened it. It simply let the truth sit there, out in the open, and moved on, trusting the audience to carry the new, harsher understanding of Brian forward with them. That willingness to wound a beloved character and then refuse to take it back is one more thread in the long, dark pattern running through the entire series. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A character betraying another character is one kind of cruelty, painful but contained safely inside the cartoon, where no real person gets hurt. Out in the real world, though, the show's sharp tongue would land it in genuine trouble of a very different sort. One of the most beloved and respected comedy legends in all of American history would catch just a few seconds of Family Guy poking fun at her, feel so deeply wronged by it, and grow so furious about how her famous creation had been used that she would do something no angry tweet or harsh interview could ever do. She would march the entire show straight into a courtroom and demand millions of dollars for the insult. Section 9. The 5 seconds that went to court by the middle of its run, Family Guy had built a long list of famous people it had poked fun at. Singers, actors, politicians, athletes, news anchors, all of them had taken a hit at one point or another. Most of those jokes flew by in a flash and were forgotten by the next scene. The show would name a star, draw a quick cartoon of them doing something silly, and roll on without a second thought. Almost none of those targets ever did anything about it. They grumbled, or they laughed it off, or they simply ignored it and went about their day. One of them, though, refused to let it slide. She was one of the most loved and most respected names in the entire history of American comedy. And when she saw what the show had done with her, she did not write an angry letter or fire back in an interview. She took Family Guy to court. Her name was Carol Burnett. To understand why this fight mattered so much, a person has to understand who she was. For 11 years, from 1967 all the way to 1978, she ran a program on the CBS network called The Carol Burnett Show. It was a variety show, the kind of program packed with comedy sketches, songs, and dancing all stitched together. She and her cast, including well-known performers like Harvey Korman, Vicki Lawrence, and Tim Conway, made each other and the country laugh week after week. The show was a giant. Over its long life, it won 25 major awards, and it carved out a permanent spot in the memory of everyone who grew up watching it. Burnett herself became something close to comedy royalty, a warm and beloved figure who had spent decades earning the respect of millions. She was not some easy target who could be brushed aside. She was a legend. A few pieces of her show became famous all on their own, and 2 of them sat right at the center of the fight that was coming. The first was a character she played called the Charwoman. A charwoman is just an old word for a cleaning lady, and that is exactly what the character was. A quiet, gentle cleaning woman in a blue bonnet who carried a mop and a bucket. Burnett played her with such heart that the character became the mascot of the whole show, beloved by everyone who watched. That little cleaning lady mattered enough that the actual costume Burnett wore now sits inside the Smithsonian, one of the most important museums in the entire country. The Charwoman was not a throwaway. She was a treasured piece of television history. The second famous piece was something Burnett did at the close of every single episode. She would reach up and gently tug on her ear. For years, fans wondered what the little gesture meant. The answer was sweet and personal. The ear tug was a secret hello, a quiet signal she sent to her grandmother, the woman who had raised her. Every time she pulled her ear at the end of a show, she was reaching across the airwaves to say hello to the person she loved. It was one of the tenderest little traditions in all of television, a small private message hidden in plain sight for the whole world to see without understanding. Now picture taking those 2 warm, gentle things, the kindly cleaning lady and the loving wave to a grandmother, and dragging them into a cartoon about a porn shop. That is precisely what Family Guy did. The episode was called Pet Erotica. It first aired in April of 2006, during the show's 4th season. The setup is simple and crude in the usual Family Guy way. Peter and his friends walk into an adult store, the kind of shady shop that sells dirty films and blow-up dolls. Peter, looking around, says he is surprised by how clean the place is. One of his friends explains why. He says the shop is clean because Carol Burnett works there part-time as a janitor. The camera then cuts away for just a few seconds. There, mopping the floor of the porn shop, stands a cartoon version of the charwoman, blue bonnet and all, dragging her mop past a row of blow-up dolls and a rack of dirty movies. In the background, a slightly changed version of the famous Carol Burnett show theme music plays along. The whole thing lasted less than 5 seconds. Then came the part that stung even more. The characters started talking about her famous ear tug. One of them claimed that when Burnett tugged her ear at the end of her show, she was really saying goodnight to her mother. Then another character, the show's resident creep, added a crude and ugly joke, wondering what part of herself she might have tugged to say goodnight to her father. It was a vulgar little jab, the sort the show tossed off by the hundreds, and it twisted her sweet private family gesture into something dirty. To Family Guy, this was nothing special. It was 5 seconds of screen time in an episode stuffed with dozens of other gags. To Carol Burnett, it was something else entirely. She was deeply offended, and she had good reason to be. The show had taken her most cherished character, the gentle cleaning lady now sitting in a national museum, and stuck her in a porn shop. It had taken the loving little signal she sent to her grandmother and made it the setup for a filthy joke about her own father. For a woman who had spent her whole life building a warm and respected name, watching all of that get dragged through the mud in a cartoon felt like a slap in the face. There was an extra layer to her anger too, and it came from something that had happened before the episode ever aired. According to her lawsuit, back in 2005, the people at Fox had actually reached out to her and asked for permission to use the theme song from her show inside an episode of Family Guy. Burnett said no. She turned them down. And then, by her account, the episode was written anyway, using her music and her character and her famous gesture without the permission she had clearly refused to give. So this was not a case of a star simply being surprised by a joke. In her eyes, she had already told the show no, and the show had gone ahead and done it regardless. That made the whole thing feel less like a careless gag and more like a deliberate insult. So in March of 2007, Carol Burnett did something almost none of Big Guy's targets had ever dared to do. She filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox, the studio behind the show. Her complaint laid out several arguments. She said the show had broken copyright law by using her charwoman character without asking. She said the show had stolen her name and her likeness for its own use, and she said it had trampled on her right to control how her own image was used. To make her point as loud as possible, she asked for a huge sum of money in damages, more than $6 million. A legend of American comedy was now standing in a courtroom, demanding that the crude little cartoon answer for what it had done to her. The studio behind Family Guy did not back down or apologize. Instead, it leaned on an argument that had saved the show before. Fox put out a statement pointing out something that carried a sharp little sting of its own. Family Guy, the studio said, was famous for poking fun at famous people and spoofing bits of pop culture, the very same thing that the Carol Burnett show had been famous for in its own day. In other words, the studio was reminding everyone that Burnett's own beloved program had built a chunk of its fame on parody, on taking famous movies and stars and making fun of them in sketches. The show that made her a legend had done the exact kind of joking she was now trying to punish. It was a clever and pointed defense, turning her own legacy back around to shield the cartoon. The case landed in front of a federal judge named Dean Pregerson, and it did not drag on for long. After only about 3 months, in June of 2007, the judge made his decision, and he sided with Family Guy. He threw the lawsuit out. The reason came down to one powerful idea in American law: the protection of parody. Parody is when you take something famous and twist it, exaggerate it, or mock it to make a joke or a point. The law gives that kind of comedy a lot of room to breathe because making fun of famous things is treated as a form of free speech. The judge ruled that sticking a cartoon charwoman in a ridiculous, crude, over-the-top situation counted as exactly that kind of protected parody. The show had taken just enough of her character and her music to make her recognizable, and then it had used that recognition to build a joke. That, the court decided, was allowed. The judge was careful, though, in how he described Burnett herself. He did not dismiss her as unimportant or treat her with anything less than respect. In his ruling, he noted plainly that Carol Burnett is an icon in American culture, a performer deeply respected and loved by a huge part of the public, and that her charwoman character held that same treasured place. He understood completely that the joke debased her, that it dragged her gentle character into something low and ugly. He simply ruled that, under the law, being mocked in poor taste was something even a beloved icon had to put up with. The cartoon was crude, the cartoon was rude, but the cartoon was, in the eyes of the court, legal. So Family Guy won. For the second time in its history, it had walked into a courtroom over a joke and walked back out with its right to make that joke fully intact. The first time, years earlier, the fight had been over a twisted version of an old Disney song. This time, the fight had been over a beloved comedian and her cleaning lady. Both times, the answer from the law came back the same. The show was allowed to take famous things and bend them into jokes, even mean ones, even crude ones, even ones that genuinely wounded the people on the receiving end. end. The courtroom had become one more arena where Family Guy proved it could do almost anything it wanted and survive. There is a real sadness sitting underneath the whole story, though, and it has nothing to do with who won. The deepest part of this fight was never really about money or about the law at all. It was about the gap between how the show saw the joke and how Burnett saw it. To the people writing the cartoon, the charwoman in the porn shop was a quick throwaway gag, 5 seconds of silliness in a show that fired off silliness by the truckload. They likely never thought hard about the woman behind the character at all. To Carol Burnett, those 5 seconds reached into the most personal corners of her life. They touched the character that sits in a museum as a piece of her legacy. They touched the secret signal she sent to the grandmother who raised her. The show treated her like just another famous name to mock, and it never once stopped to think that the name belonged to a real person with real feelings and a real history tied to every piece it was making fun of. This is what made the Burnett fight a different shade of dark from the others. The death of Brian was the show wounding its own loyal fans on purpose. The banned episodes were the network silencing the writers out of fear. The cruel speech aimed at Brian was the show turning on one of its own characters. The Burnett lawsuit shows the show reaching out into the real world and bruising a living, breathing legend, a woman in her 70s who had given the country decades of laughter, and then refusing to so much as say sorry when she stood up and told them they had hurt her. The show did not need to apologize because the law said it did not have to, so it did not. It simply pocketed the win and moved along to the next episode, the way it always did. For Carol Burnett, the loss in court did not erase the hurt. She had not gone to a judge chasing a payday. She had gone because she felt that something precious to her had been stolen, soiled, and she wanted the world to know she would not stand quietly by while it happened. Losing the case meant the law would not help her, yet it did not mean she was wrong to feel wounded. Plenty of people watching the whole thing unfold felt she had every right to be angry that a beloved old comedian deserved gentler treatment than being dropped into a cartoon porn shop. Others sided with the show and the judge, arguing that comedy has to be free to mock anyone, even the most beloved figures, or else it stops being free at all. That same old argument, the one that had followed Family Guy through its entire life, surfaced once again. Where is the line between a joke and an insult, and who gets to decide where it falls? The Burnett case settled into the show's history as one more clash survived, one more famous foe faced down without a scrap. The cartoon had taken on a comedy legend in open court and come away untouched. Yet the bitter taste lingered for the people who felt the show had simply been cruel to someone who deserved better. A win in a courtroom is not the same thing as being right, and the gap between those two ideas is a gap Family Guy has always been happy to live inside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every famous person the show angered, though, had the option of fighting back in a courtroom at all. Some battles played out in a far more public and personal way, with no judge and no lawyers anywhere in sight. The next clash would pull in another well-known figure who felt deeply wronged by the show, and rather than reaching for a lawyer, that person would strike back out in the open, turning the feud into a bruising fight watched by everyone, with neither side ever willing to back down. Section 10. The group that declared war, the fight with Carol Burnett, had played out in a courtroom with lawyers and a judge and a clear winner at the end. The next great enemy the show made was a different beast altogether. This one never set foot in a courtroom, never asked for a single dollar, and never went away. It was not a movie star or a singer or a politician with a wounded ego. It was a whole organization, a group built from the ground up to watch shows like Family Guy and to try to scrub them off the air. For years, the two sides circled each other, throwing punches in public, and neither one was ever willing to back down. The show had finally met an enemy whose entire reason for existing was to destroy it. The group was called the Parents Television Council. A conservative activist named Brent Bozell started it back in the 1990s, and its whole purpose was right there in its name. It existed to protect children from what it saw as filth on television. Its slogan said the quiet part out loud, reminding everyone that our children are watching. The idea behind the group was simple enough. Television was getting cruder and dirtier every year, the group believed, and somebody needed to stand guard, to point at the worst offenders and shout loud enough that parents, advertisers, and the government would all pay attention. For a long stretch of years, the group was very good at exactly that. It had real teeth, and plenty of shows learned to fear the sound of its bark. To understand the war, a person has to understand one more thing, and that is the power of a government office called the FCC. The letters stand for the Federal Communications Commission. In plain terms, it is the part of the United States government that keeps watch over what gets broadcast on regular television and radio. It has the power to punish a channel for airing things judged too dirty or too vulgar for the public airwaves, and that punishment can come in the form of enormous fines, large enough to make any network sweat. The Parents Television Council understood this perfectly. Its favorite weapon was to whip up its members into firing off floods of complaints to the FCC, hoping the government would step in and bring the hammer down on the shows it hated. The group could not not cancel a show by itself. What it could do was point the loaded gun of the government straight at a show and pull as hard as it could on the trigger. Almost from the moment Family Guy first appeared, the Parents Television Council marked it as a top enemy. The group went after the show again and again, naming it the worst show on television for a given week on at least 40 separate occasions over the years. 40 times the group held the show up to the country as the single most rotten thing on the air. The group hated nearly everything about it. It hated the crude jokes, the sex gags, the violence, the way the show seemed to treat every sacred thing in life as a target for a cheap laugh. To the watchdogs, Family Guy was a kind of poison being pumped into living rooms where children might be sitting, and they made it their mission to choke off the supply. The list of episodes that set the watchdogs off grew long over the years. One early episode, named And the Wiener Is, got tagged as the worst show of its week and reported straight to the government over its sex-so content. Another episode in which Peter and a small singing group cheerfully dance around the bed of a man dying of a terrible illness was held up as proof that the show would mind even sickness and death for a quick laugh. As the years rolled on, the group kept logging fresh complaints as against episode after episode, building a thick file of everything it found unforgivable. Each new season seemed to hand the watchdogs more ammunition, and they fired all of it at the same target. The pattern almost never broke. The show would air something rude, the group would howl, the complaints would fly toward the government, and then nothing of real consequence would happen at all. One battle in particular shows just how much firepower the group could muster. There was an episode called Family Gay, and the watchdog group decided it had crossed every line there was, so the group did what it did best. It rallied its members and aimed them at the government. By one count, members of the Parents Television Council sent a staggering number of letters to the FCC over that single episode, somewhere around 188,000 of them. That is not a typo. Nearly 200,000 complaint letters rained down on the government over one half-hour cartoon. It was a show of force meant to frighten the network and force the government to act. And then, after all of that effort, all of those letters, all of that fury, the government did nothing. The FCC took no action at all. The flood of complaints, for all its size, crashed against the show and left it stand. That outcome points to the strange shape of this whole war. The watchdog group was loud, it was organized, and it could generate complaint letters by the hundreds of thousands. Yet, for all that noise, it kept losing. The fines it begged for did not come. The cancellations it prayed for did not happen. The show it called the worst thing on television just kept right on airing, week after week, season after season, growing more popular all the while. The group could make a tremendous amount of noise, but it could not actually land a knockout blow. And the longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became that Family Guy was not afraid of the watchdogs at all. Before long, the show decided to stop merely surviving the attacks and to start swinging back. The counterpunch came in the form of an entire episode, and it was about as direct a middle finger as a show can throw. The episode was called PTV, and the title itself was a sly joke. Those three letters were a twist on the initials of the Parent Television Council, a way of naming the enemy without quite naming it. The episode first aired in November of 2005, and the whole thing was built as one long answer to the censors who had been hounding the show. The plot kicks off when a famous actor accidentally exposes himself during a live awards show on television. The slip-up sends the FCC into a frenzy, and the government agency starts censoring everything in sight, hacking away at every show on the air until nothing rude is left anywhere. Fed up, Peter decides to start his own television network, run right out of his house, where he can broadcast whatever he wants with no censors to answer to. He calls it PTV. At first, it is a glorious free-for-all of crude, uncensored programming. Then the FCC arrives to shut him down, and the story turns even sharper. The government does not stop at censoring the television shows. It starts censoring the actual people of the town, bleeping out their swear words with a loud air horn, banning rude noises, and even slapping a black bar over Peter's body when he steps out of the shower. The episode pushes the idea to its most ridiculous extreme to make a single point. Once you let the censors start deciding what people are allowed to say and see, the censors will never stop. They will keep reaching further and further into ordinary life until they are controlling everything. The heart of the episode is a big musical number sung by Peter, Stewie, and Brian that tears into the FCC with open mockery. The three of them dance around belting out a song that paints the government censors as insane, prudish busybodies poking their noses where they do not belong. It is loud, it is silly, and it is completely unafraid. The whole sequence was the show standing up on a stage in front of the entire country and laughing in the faces of the people trying to silence it. The episode was a direct response not just to the watchdog group, but to the wave of government crackdowns that had swept across television after a famous incident at a Super Bowl halftime show when a singer was briefly exposed on live national TV and the country lost its mind. The FCC had grown fierce and punishing after that night, and Family Guy answered that fierceness with a song and a joke and a refusal to be scared. The man behind behind the show did not hide his feelings about the Watchdog group either. Seth MacFarlane went after them in public in interviews with words that left no room for confusion about how he felt. In one interview around 2008, he compared getting criticism from the Parents Television Council to receiving hate mail from Hitler. He called the people in the group rotten to the core and terrible human beings. He pointed out the strange gap he saw in them, that here was an organization that wrapped itself in Christian values while seeming to spend its every waking hour hating other people. He, by his own description, was not even religious, and yet he felt he could see more decency in his own approach than in theirs. There was no olive branch in any of it, no attempt to find middle ground. He treated the group not as worried parents with a point worth hearing, but as enemies who deserved nothing but scorn. Underneath all the songs and the insults and the complaint letters sat a real and serious question, the kind that has no easy answer. The Watchdog group was not entirely wrong to worry. Family Guy was, by any honest measure, a crude show full of jokes about sex, violence, and every dark corner of life, and it aired at a time when children could easily stumble onto it. The group genuinely believed it was protecting kids from harm. On the other side stood the show and everyone who valued the freedom to make whatever art and comedy they wanted without a government office or a band of angry strangers deciding what was allowed. That freedom is one of the most treasured ideas in the country, the right to say things that other people find offensive without being punished by the government for saying them. The whole war was really a fight between two good things crashing into each other, the wish to shield children from ugliness and the wish to keep speech free. Both sides believed they were the heroes, and that is exactly why neither could ever give an inch. There was an extra layer of meaning hiding in the fight, too, one tied to the show's own shaky beginnings. In its earliest years, Family Guy had been a weak and fragile thing, shoved around and eventually canceled, and pressure from censors and the FCC had been part of the storm that nearly killed it the first time around. So when the older, stronger version of the show made an entire episode mocking the censors, it was not just blowing off steam. It was a survivor turning around to spit at the very forces that had once almost ended it. The show that had nearly been silenced in its crib had grown up big enough and strong enough to write a whole song laughing at the people who had tried to silence it. That is a kind of revenge served slow and loud on national television. In the end, time settled the war in a way that no single episode or lawsuit ever could. The show simply outlasted its enemy, the Parent Television Council. The group that had spent years calling Family Guy the worst thing on television slowly lost its grip on the culture. As more and more people moved to streaming services and away from regular broadcast television, the old weapons stopped working. The government office that once struck fear into networks held far less power over a world where shows lived online beyond its reach. The Watchdog group that had once roared so loudly faded into the background, and by the year 2025, it had sunk so far that it filed for bankruptcy. The enemy that had tried for so long to bury Family Guy ran out of money and momentum, while the cartoon it had hunted was still on the air, still making jokes, still very much alive. There is one last twist that captures the whole strange war perfectly. The very episode the show made to mock the censors, the one packed with the things the Watchdogs hated most, was later put on display by Fox itself as a piece of comedy to be proud of, featured in a network special celebrating its funniest moments. The thing built as a weapon against the censors became a trophy on the network's own shelf. The show had been told its humor was filth that needed scrubbing away, and a few years later that same humor was being held up as a highlight. The Watchdogs had lost on every front that mattered. This was a different shade of the show's darkness from anything that came before. The death of Brian was the show wounding its own fans. The banned episodes were the network silencing the writers. The Burnett lawsuit was the show bruising a beloved legend. This fight was the show locked in open, bare-knuckle war with a group that wanted it dead and choosing not to flinch, not to soften, and not to apologize, but to fight back with songs and insults and pure defiance. Whether that makes the show brave or simply stubborn depends on where a person stands. What is certain is that Family Guy treated the people trying to censor it not as a threat to be feared, but as a punchline to be mocked, and it kept on mocking them until they finally ran out of road.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.